Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having us. I know we said we'd start at 8:05, which we will. But at first, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Yazan al-Saadi, and I will be moderating this talk we have set up for you today. The talk is titled From Syria to Palestine, the People's Resistance. And the aim of the talk today is to explore the popular resistance movements against the Zionist settler colonial state, and popular resistance movements against dictatorships in the region. In particular, the connections and challenges between Palestinian and Syrian grassroots movements and resistance and revolutions. For this talk, we have a bunch of wonderful sponsors, such as the Revive the Peace Movement, Global Campaign of Solidarity with the Syrian Revolution, New Politics Magazine, and People Demand Change. In particular, Revive the Peace Movement has been working for 5 years and would really love to share their future events with the audience. To get on their mailing list, there is a link to a Google Doc in the comments. Please click on it and add your name and email if you're interested to find out what they have planned. Now, to our talk. Syria and Palestine sit at one of the most important nexuses for our region and for, one can argue, the international community. And here, when I say the international community, I don't mean the traditional meaning of Western wealthy states that are very powered. This matters not only for the region, but for all of us, wherever we are. I am currently in Beirut. A couple of our speakers are in Palestine, and a couple of our speakers are in Europe and the US. So with the transnational aspects of how we're talking, clearly there's something that is of value for us all. Before we start our talk, we wanted to mark a few dates that occurred this August, which I think will buttress the connections between all our movements. Of the dates I want to talk about, for example, the first one is the Gaza massacre on August 31st, 1953, when Ariel Sharon led a couple of forces of the Zionist entity and massacred around 100 people in Gaza in the town of El Boreg. The other date I wanted to commemorate or think about occurred on August 29th, 1967. And it's the 3 no's that was done by the Arab League. As we all know now, most Arab countries have sold out. And this is something that we should commemorate as a tragedy. Another tragedy I wanted to talk about that occurred or was commemorated this past week was the Tel Zatar massacre that occurred on August 12th, 1976, in which the Syrian Assad regime massacred up to, according to estimates, 2,000 to 3,000 Palestinians. I would also want to commemorate another tragedy, which is the Oslo Accords that were announced in August 26, 1993. As we all know, the Oslo Accords was an absolute disaster for the Palestinian people. Another horrible tragedy that occurred in the month of August was the Ghouta chemical attacks of August 21st, 2013, in which the Assad regime unleashed chemical weapons on the population of Ghouta. It should be noted that the Assad regime has used chemical weapons at least, according to the OPCW, at least 33 times in the course of the war, if not more. And finally, being in Beirut, I also wanted to commemorate the Beirut port explosion that happened on August 4th, 2020, in which I think, and as many Lebanese do, and others non-Lebanese in the country, that the responsibility falls on all political parties, regardless of their ideology. I think this final point should be known that regardless if an entity is in the left or the right of the political spectrum, if they do not support a people, then they are an enemy of the people, in my opinion. Now, with further ado, I wanted to start by introducing our speakers. There are 3 speakers we're going to have today. The first one is Joseph Daher. Joseph Daher teaches at the Yazan University in Switzerland and is a part-time affiliate professor at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. He is also the author of Syria After the Uprising and Hezbollah, the Political Economy of the Party of God. After him, the next speaker will be Nidal Bitar, who is a Syrian Palestinian based in DC, where he is the managing director of People Demand Change. Nidal holds a master's in political science, sociology, working with several INGOs. He also worked as a journalist and researcher with NPR's Beirut office, and his work has been featured in the Washington Post, Newsline magazine, and other news outlets and websites in the Arab world and the US. And finally, perhaps, in my opinion, the best speaker of them all, Mariam Barghouti, who is a Palestinian-American writer, blogger, researcher, activist, commemorator, and journalist. She hails from the Palestinian city of Ramallah. Her political commentary and research work has notably featured in Al Jazeera English, The Guardian, BBC, Huffington Post, The New York Times, Middle East Monitor, Newsweek, Mondoweiss, International Business Time, and TRT-World. The time is now 8:09 p.m. Beirut and 1:09 p.m. Great Satan time. So without further ado, I would like Joseph to start. And I'm going to start him off with a basic leading question. Joseph, describe to us the state. Could you describe the history of popular resistance and collaboration between Syrians and Palestinians to start us off?
Thank you, Yazan. Thank you for all the team for organizing this event. It is a pleasure to be with all of you and the other speakers. It's a great honor. I think it's an important question you're asking because very often we forget that there's a historical deepness to support from below, to solidarity from below between Palestinians and Syrians, going back to the beginning of the 20th century. As soon as as with the establishment of colonial powers, especially French and Britain in the Middle East, we already see in the 20s, criticism of in Syria of people that are also relatives of Palestinian national leadership in Palestine, criticizing the Zionist project, the colonial project, but also in both countries, or what we say in both regions at the time, criticizing French and British colonialism. So at the mid-20s, beginning of 20s, you already have this kind of criticism. And actually, when you have the great strike in Syria in 1935, you have forms of solidarity from Palestine, support that came through solidarity, through funding, through different ways of support to the Syrian strike. And when you have the great Palestinian Intifada or Palestinian revolt of 36 to 39, you have also different forms of support from Syria to Palestine, whether boycott of Jewish companies that are based in Palestine. You have support of funding to particular political groups, armed groups. You have also Palestinian days of support, and you have armed support as well. You have lots of combatants, fighters going to Palestine to fight against the Zionists and the British colonial army. We have famous names such as Izzeddin Qassam, who also had, sparked a peasant revolt in Hama in 35 in Syria and participated in the Palestinian revolt as well. You have other Syrian fighters that were very important in the great Syrian revolt of 25 and 27. For example, fighters such as Fawzi Qawqiji, who became, a fighter as well in Palestine. So you already had this kind of support at this time. What is interesting also, there was a great form of disparity from the support from below, which was very important. And as I was telling you, these forms of support and the leadership, the elites, the Syrian bourgeoisie that was pushed to support the Palestinian revolt, but was rather unwilling to do so because they didn't want to, first of all, have bad relationship with the British and the French colonial. So because there was in a form of honorable cooperation with the colonial elite. And I think this is something to remember, that throughout the history of liberation and emancipation, you have this class issue that is very important. The bourgeois elite rather seeking a form of understanding, form of cooperation with the colonial or the elite in some ways, or imperialists later on, or regional powers, while you have solidarity from below wanting to challenge rather radically the status quo and for liberation and emancipation. So we can see this since the 20s and the 30s. After a second period, I would say, of strong solidarity from below was obviously the 60s and the 70s, following the Six-Day War, which marked nearly the end symbolically of Arab nationalism, the defeat of the Nasser regime in Egypt, and the radical Syrian Ba'athist regime. You had a period of radicalization with new left parties emerging, and also the Palestinian national movement re-emerging, being autonomous, and taking very much importance throughout the Middle East, and collaborating with various leftist radical parties, and such as the Palestinian Popular Front, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, but even Fatah, were, you know, centers of resistance very often on many aspects, in which you had many people of the region basically going to refugee camps in Jordan until the 70s, but Lebanon afterwards, and to less extent until the 70s, 60s to Syria, in which, you know, yeah, Palestinian refugee camps were centers of resistance, where you learn basically struggle from below, resistance, etc. And a lot of people from this new left that would emerge with the end of the 60s and 70s. Obviously, there's also this international, you know, kind of, it's not only a regional effect, but you have a new international left that is independent from the Soviet Union, from that is emerging, that is much more radical, trying to change the status quo. So you have different examples. You have in Yemen, for example, the Marxist-oriented National Liberal Front, which formed the People's Republic of South Yemen, which will later be renamed in the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, that played an important role also in supporting the Palestinian resistance. You had in Oman, Dhofar region, also the Dhofar Liberation Front, which was also inspired by Marxism, is also challenging the kingdom, and other various leftist organizations from the Egyptian Communist Workers' Communist Parties, but also in Syria, coming back to Syria, for example, what we call Hizb al-Amal al-Shuri, which has different translation, let's say, from the Labour Communist Party or the Party of Action, the Action Communist Party, in which, you know, a lot of its individuals basically learn radical politics and in refugee camps in Lebanon. Many of them that were part of, you know, Marxist circles, which was the origins basically of the Action Communist Party, Hizb al-Amal al-Shuri, basically went to join Palestinian groups such as the Democratic Front for Liberation of Palestine, or the Popular Front of Lebanon, and were martyred in the resistance against Lebanon. And actually, Hizb al-Amal al-Shuri, the Labour Communist Party, or the Action Communist Party, sent armed fighters to Lebanon in the 80s to protect the PLO from the various Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And actually, some of their members in the memoir sending, you know, they were in prison in Syria, sending letters to Hafez al-Assad at the time and saying, you know, basically free us and we'll go defend the PLO in Beirut. And they refused. And they understand very, very soon that the liberation of Palestine was linked to the liberation of all the peoples from the region, saying that, you know, the liberation of Palestine goes through all the capital of the region. This was very much present throughout the 60s and 70s, not only in Syria, but in the various countries of the region, and especially among the leftist parties in Palestine. Also, what happened in Syria, for example, the Hizb al-Amal al-Shuri, so the Labour Communist Party, played a key role in the establishment of popular committees throughout the 83 and 86, which is a movement that gathered Palestinians in Syria. The movement described itself as a national democratic popular structure, and not seeking to become a political party, but challenging, for example, the repression of the same regime of Palestinian groups in the 80s in Lebanon. And for everyone to remember, Syrian regime entered Lebanon in the 70s to support the extreme right wing, the Falangist parties, etc., against the Palestinian left and the Lebanese left. And so they formed, and there were a repression that was terrible against Syrian Palestinians trying to organize in the camps. And in the beginning of the 90s, you had more than 2,500 prisoners, just to give you an idea. So there was form of conversion from below. And what is interesting to see is after in the Palestinian Intifada of 2000 was a new also lesson. Basically, it started a new wave of resistance throughout the region, from Egypt to Syria to Bahrain, etc. And actually, during the Palestinian Intifada in the 2000, what happened is that you had forms of solidarity in universities in Syria that were repressed by the Syrian regime because it didn't come from the regime itself. And we'll witness the same thing quite recently. If you remember Yazan, in the latest Israeli war against Gaza, they had a demonstration of solidarity in Damascus that was repressed because no picture of Bashar al-Assad was present. And at the same time, again, you can see this class distinction between the bourgeois, I think, elite, not willing to support the Palestinian resistance, historically speaking, because it's not only about the emancipation and liberation of the Palestinians, but of the region very often. Palestinians have been an example on this level. And actually, the opposition in Syria, the exiled opposition of the official bodies, such as the Syrian National Council, National Coalition for Syrian Revolution, and opposition forces, were also very keen not to show any kind of strong support to the Palestinian solidarity because they do not want basically to scare their Western support, to growth support. And even at the beginning of the revolution saying, we won't talk about the Palestinian issue. But there were forms of solidarity in the Palestinian refugee camps, such as Yarmouth, but I think Nidal will speak more about this. So just to resume, you have a history of solidarity from below that is not only about emancipation and liberation, but has also a class perspective that is, I think, very important, in which the leadership of the region never felt at ease with Palestinian liberation because it was also challenging their power. And I think this is something very important to understand with the Palestinian cause.
Joe, sorry to cut you off, but I think this is a very interesting point, and it leads me to a secondary question. Just like you said, there seems to be a separation between solidarity from below to the Palestinian cause and regimes. And we know recently when there's discussions, particularly on Syria, a lot of the international left, the quote-unquote international mainstream left, seems to rally around the Syrian regime, Bashar al-Assad, on the grounds that it is quote-unquote anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist, and is, supporting the resistance in the Palestinian cause. Can you talk a bit about this dynamic and how perhaps, or arguably, there is a weaponization by the Assad regime of the Palestinian cause to allow its sustainability and allow, people to rally around it?
Yes, I think you're right, partially speaking. On the international left, unfortunately, also the regional left. Also, we shouldn't forget, about even the Arab left, or the Palestinian left, the Syrian left. Certain section of this, and obviously there are divisions, but strong section of the left, unfortunately, regarding, for example, the Syrian revolution, took rather saying a bad position, would say not only a bad position, but I think betrayed the principles of the left, which is basically emancipation and liberation, and being in support of people in struggle, especially against a bourgeois, reactionary, collaborative regime in all aspects, I think, of it. And I think there's different reasons behind this. First of all, I think it's decades of defeat of the left, and losing the principle of, a key principle for me is that self-emancipation of the people will come from the people themselves, and not thinking, that you arrive with an elitist brand, or you will be the only one knowing the truth, etc. I think this is the idea that not believing anymore that only the popular masses can free themselves through their own struggle for reform and revolution is unfortunately something that has been lost by large sectors of the left, internationally and regionally, unfortunately speaking. And this is what led also, sections of the left, whether in Palestine or in the Middle East, to try to form, coalition or let's say collaboration with authoritarian regimes. And this, unfortunately, from the left to the right, and from the Popular Front, Democratic Front, to Hamas and Fatah, collaborating with authoritarian regimes, or in some cases, such as the Palestinian Authority, with the US to try to seek some form of liberation, or Hamas with Turkey and Qatar. And I think this is, whether it's not surprising from right-wing political parties, it's not only surprising, but really a form of disappointment when it comes from the left. So forgetting that self-emancipation of the people comes from their own struggle and not from small groups. So this this also led to supporting what they call, in their sense, but not living under it, the lesser evil. Whether imperial or regional powers like Russia and Iran, I invite these kind of forces to go live in these kind of countries and to see the repression against leftist parties, democratic parties that we can see in Russia and Iran, against feminists, ecologists, etc. We have, or the Assad regime, for this sake, that has repressed any form of trade unions, professional association, democratic parties, progressive parties, since it came to power in the 70s. So, and their talks, whether this kind of international left, which is mostly Stalinist or campist, their discourse around anti-imperialism and against, I think it's between quotes, becomes just only anti-rhetoric. It's just rhetoric. And it's mostly about opposing rhetorically the US and practically actually collaborating with the US, with having the same, horizon or the same aspect. For example, struggling against terrorism. You can see that the US discourse is very similar sometimes to some sections of the left, saying basically you have to collaborate with Russia to get the end of Daesh. Not saying that Daesh is basically, what are the roots of Daesh? Is basically the imperial powers and the regional states, the lack of the absence of democracy, the absence of economic development, the absence of political life, democratic life, etc. So you can see a discourse that is very similar. And basically, these sections of the left that are, for me, betrayed all the principle of the left, they end siding with other capitalist and authoritarian regimes or capitalist Western states in facts, basically. And actually, they defame the struggle of the masses for their own liberation, which I think is a catastrophe. And we've seen this a lot in so-called anti-war movements, basically, that were very silent when it came to other very much opposing the war of Russia on Syria, the war of Iran on Syria. They were very absent. And I think they did this on the discourse of a famous text of Karl Liebknecht, who was a German socialist, Austrian socialist, sorry. No, German socialist, sorry. I'm not sure now, but basically saying, only taking a part of his discourse, saying the main enemy is at home, without forgetting forgetting the part saying that we have to need solidarity from below. So of course you need to oppose US imperialism or British imperialism where you're based there, but this does not mean that you should forget your support, and even not only forget, but oppose support for progressive change from below, which was the case in the Syrian revolution. So I think this was a big, not only a mistake, but betrayal by this section of the left that stood were silent on Syrian revolution, other revolution as well. And again, I think internationalism We've seen in the past few years, ways of revolt against neoliberalism, against racism with Black Lives Matter, of ecology, etc. And I think this section of the left that is unable to see that change come from below, and that you will seek some form of collaboration with states, is needed to failure, and is leading to failure. Sorry, and I think they oppose.
Yeah. Joe, sorry to cut you off. We're just running a bit out of time, but I think your point has been very succinctly made.
Sorry.
We will come back. No, I think this is quite important. And I believe after our talks, we're going to have a group discussion with other speakers, and we can really bring this out there. So I really wanted to thank you for your quick, brief intervention. And we're going to move on to our next speaker, who will be Nidal. But prior to moving to Nidal, just in case anyone missed out in the beginning, one of our sponsors, who's the Revive the Peace movement, has been working for around 5 years, and they really would like to share future events that they have planned. So if anyone that is watching would like to be on their listserv, in the comments below this video, if you're on Facebook or on YouTube, you will find a Google Doc. Just click it, add your name and email if you're interested to find further information. Now, without further ado, I would like to move on to our next speaker and to ask him, can you describe to us the state of Palestinian and Syrian solidarity and resistance in the course of the past decade? And what have been the challenges and difficulties that have emerged, and why?
Thank you, Yazan, and thank you, Joe, for this introduction. Actually, I would agree first, with all the historical introduction that Joe provided, and I would add to it that it's not only there is a connection between Palestine and Syria. Actually, there has never been a disconnection, and especially after 1948, a lot of Palestinian refugees, more like 200,000-300,000 Palestinians, moved to Syria and became refugees in Syria, and when the national Palestinian movement was built, it was built not only inside Palestine, also outside Palestine, in the camps, in the refugee camps. In Syria, there were 12 Palestinian refugee camps, and all of these camps were engaged and involved in building the national Palestinian movement, and to continue the national Palestinian movement that already started before 1948, before Nakba. This is in the first hand. And the second hand, also it's generational, these generations of Palestinians in Syria and Syrians, and they were integrated, Palestinians in Syria. Actually, this is very important to know, actually, that Palestinians in Syria, they were integrated almost completely in the Syrian society. So it's unlike Lebanon, for example. In Syria, as a Palestinian refugee, you have the right to work, right to education, right, many Palestinian refugees, they became high seniors in the Syrian army, for example, ministers and deputy ministers. I would share this personal experience or personal thing with you. For example, in 1967 war, my great uncle was a pilot, and he was the only pilot who used a Russian MiG. I think it was MiG 19, and he conducted the only attack against, or the only counter-attack against Israel, and he bombed the refinery in Haifa, and he was Palestinian in the Syrian army, and later on, so there was this full integration and between Syria for Palestinians and the Syrian society, and vice versa. Maybe Yarmouth Camp is one of the examples that would show you exactly what I mean, because Yarmouth Camp was part of the city of Damascus. It was not in the suburbs, and it was a big community that included in it it was like when I left Syria in 2011, the population of the camp was almost 1 million. Only 150,000 of them were Palestinians. Although, like Palestinians inside the camp, they gave this camp the Palestinian identity. And Syrians who lived in the camp also, they were integrated and became like Palestinians, you know, rather than like Palestinians in this camp became like had like a strong Syrian identity. However, this identity was mixed to an extent that when the Syrian revolution started in March 2011, you could see in the Syrian and the Palestinian communities in the camps the same opinions and divisions that you would see in the Syrian community or the Syrian society. However, there is a long history between Palestinian camps and the national movements and the Palestinian factions and the Syrian regime, especially like after 1970, when Hafez al-Assad, the Assad father, came to power, and this connection between the Palestinian factions and the Syrian government or the Syrian regime after night like took different shape and took different forms, because one of the things that Hafez al-Assad tried to do and worked very hard on doing is to control the narrative of the Palestinian struggle, and this was impossible without controlling PLO. And controlling PLO led Hafez al-Assad to go through a huge fights between the Syrian regime in general and the Palestinian national movement represented by PLO at the time. And at the same time, there was a huge opposition for Hafez al-Assad against Hafez al-Assad inside Syria. And this opposition, it's very important to know that this opposition found it's a good environment to grow and to be protected in the Palestinian camps in Syria. So for this reason, especially like when we are talking about the socialist and the communist movements that Hafez al-Assad oppressed or pressed in the 1970s and later in 1980s, and this is when Joe was saying that by 1991 there was about 2,500 Palestinians imprisoned inside by al-Assad regime. It's all because the National Palestinian Movement, especially the left side, the left wing of it, was well integrated and well involved with the Syrian opposition along the history since 1970 until 2011. Most of these, like the Syrian intelligentsia and the Syrian opposition personnel, they used to live actually and physically inside the Palestinian camps, the Palestinian refugee camps, especially in Yarmouth Camp. In this context, we can understand the connectivity between the Palestinian national movement and the Syrian revolution, and why Yarmouth Camp in Syria played this role in supporting the Syrian revolution, and why, in fact, it was punished by the Syrian government. And this is the surreal issue, like when we talk about the Syrian government, and when we talk about the Syrian government support for resistance, for when we say, and like when the apologists around the world, they talk about the Syrian resistance to imperialism or whatever, they dropped completely from their consideration what happened in Yarmouth Camp, that this camp was completely genocided by the Syrian government, was starved to death. People were literally starved to death in that camp, and punished by the Assad regime the sun, and completely now like disappeared. As I mentioned in one of the articles, like this camp, it did not only played, or Palestinian camps did not only play a role, well, like in the Syrian opposition movement against Hafiz al-Assad. Hafiz al-Assad himself, like, used the camps and lived literally in Yarmouth Camp for a while, and hid in Yarmouth Camp when there was a movement against Ba'athist in Syria in 50s and 60s, and during the separation between Syria and Egypt. Hafiz al-Assad lived in the Yarmouth Camp, lived in my great-grandfather's house. He slept there, and he got to know all the Palestinian leadership in the communities, and he used them when, like, in the Ba'athist revolution in 1963, and used the Palestinian factions to support the coup in 1970. Maybe this is something it's less known, that who took control of the Ministry of Defense in 1970. It was a Palestinian brigade. It's called the Brigade of Fidel, Katibat al-Fidaiyin. So the connectivity between in politics and the struggle in Syria and Palestine, whether it was against the Israeli colonialism and occupation, or to build the Syrian national movement and the Syrian political history in Syria, it's all connected, and it's very hard to disconnect. So in this context, we understand what happened in 2011, and why a lot of Palestinians from my generation, I was born in 1979, the end of the 70s era, when Hafiz really started to get strong control of Syria. Our generation lived this oppression under, as Palestinians under Hafiz al-Assad. We saw what he did in Yarmouth Camp what happened, and we lived what happened also, what he did in Palestine, in Lebanon during the civil war, how he mobilized the Syrian army just to oppress and to kick out the PLO from Beirut, while it was under the Israeli invasion, basically. So I think so for our generation, it was a dream. Now it's the time to make a change, not only in the Syrian politics, but also in the Palestinian politics, because it's so connected, and we cannot change the Palestinian political system and the Palestinian political class that is controlling the narrative today without changing these Arab regimes. It's including and especially the Syrian regime, who is really now controlling a lot of the narratives in the region, including his attempts to control the Palestine-Israel struggle narrative. And unfortunately, we see today how Abu Mazen and the Palestinian Authority in general, and PLO even, they are building this strong alliance with the Syrian government, dropping from their consideration that this regime killed, arrested Palestinian refugees in Yarmouth Camp and other camps and else camps in Syria. I would close this with something. I would show you to what extent this regime is interested in controlling Palestine, and how the dynamics and the mentality of what kind of mentality they have to control this narrative, or to control the narrative of Palestine. They are crazy enough that they built a security branch that is called Palestinian branch, and it is one of the worst security branches, not only inside Syria but also around the world. This is where activists, Palestinians and Syrians, were arrested since 1970 until today, and imprisoned and maybe it was created in 1980s, just to be accurate. But it is a place for torture, killing, and controlling Syrians in the name of Palestine in this way. I don't know, and maybe we can go through like a lot of details during moving ahead forwards during this discussion.
For sure, for sure. You have 2 minutes left, Nidal, and I wanted to ask briefly, why is it important for Palestinians and Syrians to work together against dictatorships, state violence, and Zionism?
Well, I mean, they share, like, there's so many things. Like, one of them, that they share this history, and as I mentioned, Yazan, the connection between Palestinian politics and the Syrian politics is not like is a historical one, and it's before colonialism. It's like during the Ottomans. Like, it's one region, and it has always been under the same, like, what happens in Syria impacts what happens in Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Palestine. And now you live in Lebanon, and you completely maybe understand this, how what's going on in Syria is impacting severely what's going on now, like severely Lebanon, and the same is Palestine. And it's a very very important and a clear example for this. I hope it's not going to take me more than 1 minute to finish it. Like, for example, Hamas. Hamas, when the revolution started, they supported the Syrian revolution against the Syrian government. But then, when all the narrative of the politics in the region it changed, Hamas changed its narrative, and now it's going back. It's going back to the Syrian government's and trying now, begging to go back and sit with Bashar al-Assad. It's just because what's going on in Syria and how the politics and the context of politics in the region changes. It changes what happens in Palestine, and this is the importance of why Palestinians and Syrians should work together. Because what's going on today is putting ideologies and the interests of political classes in the region, in Syria and Lebanon and Palestine and Jordan, actually, ahead of the interest of the peoples of Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan. And this is why you see, like, all these political systems in these 4 countries are working together, suppress any movement to end this tyrant movement or control and dictatorship regimes in this area. Because even in Lebanon, it's turning into a dictatorship. Even Abu Mazen now is a dictatorship, and so in Jordan and so in Syria goes without saying. So I think it's not only Syrians and Palestinians, people in that region all should work together to change the narrative and the future of the peoples in this in those countries.
Thank you very much. That was actually 1 minute and 8 seconds, so very well done. Let's move on to our final third speaker, who is Mariam. And I wanted to ask Mariam, this year has been extremely bloody and difficult for both Syrians, but particularly so for Palestinians. I'm thinking, of course, of the Zionist state's attack on Gaza, its attacks on Jerusalem, which are still ongoing, the PA oppression, and the uprising against the PA. Could you talk a bit about the recent Palestinian grassroots strategies to oppose and resist Zionism and its enablers?
Hi, Yazan. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Nidal and Joe, for their, and it's a very informative and incisive remarks. But I suppose what I can offer in addition to that maybe is a bit more focused on today and tomorrow, right? In terms of the Zionist repression, what we saw happening in Gaza after the brutal wars that have been taking place in 2012, in 2014, in 2018, and the constant bombings that happen in between, the starvation of Palestinians, the closure, besiegement of mostly civilian population, mostly refugees, continues to be this war crime that keeps happening. But beyond Gaza, beyond the West Bank, there's also an increase in settler repression in Haifa and in Yafa and in Safad and in Akka and Be'er Saba. And it's really important to remember that these are settlements. As discomforting as that is to hear, these are settlements, and this is settler colonialism. There isn't anything called the Israeli state. There are no borders to that. It is the replacement. So these areas have been fully ethnically cleansed, and now we're moving on to the rest. And what we saw more recently, and why it's so important to remind us of this dynamic, is because despite the repression, what we have seen is unity. Although I think a lot of our struggle in Palestine is the divide and conquer, whether it's from the Palestinian Authority or from Zionists. Divide across political factions, divide across class, divide across a racial hierarchy. Israeli Arab, quote unquote, not Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, West Bankers, Gazans, refugees. This division means we are unable to relate with our experiences. Our problems aren't exactly the same in image and manifestation, so we're unable to link up together. But what happened in the most recent escalation of Israeli settler aggression was we said enough. And that is mostly because the political factions have failed us, the international relations system has failed us, international humanitarian legal frameworks continue to fail us. So we went back to community. We went back to grassroots. Lawyers were volunteering, medics were volunteering, youth were volunteering with each other at the bare minimum of just checking up at the psychosocial level. The amount of trauma I think you keep witnessing across time holds its own impact. And that's where Palestinians succeeded, in recognizing that when political institutions fail, community can show up. And that comes with its own problems and dynamics that I think we're still facing and coming up with solutions as we go. And this is growth. So what Palestinians continue to affirm, I see, is this constant growth and this constant confrontation of the oppressive realities, even though the risks keep getting higher. Right now, the Palestinian Authority on June 24th arrested and then killed Nidal Bitar, a well-known Palestinian critic who was also running for the Legislative Council, which remained temporarily suspended by a Palestinian president who has exceeded his term by 12 years, which brings us to this dictator dynamic and the relationship between Syria and Palestine, between Palestine and the rest of the globe, where I want to go into the comments that were said by my colleagues, and I want to go into the perception of Palestinians towards Syria. So as Joe was explaining, and as Nidal was explaining, in terms of the links, they're related to our position. Palestinians, finding themselves in Syria, being treated, by comparison, treated better than other host countries. Still, I don't think, that that's a success. As long as we're refugees and in exile, we need to remember that that's not a success. Just we are able to survive up until this point. Let us return now. So perceptions of Palestinians towards the Syrian uprising came with a lot of trauma, I think, of what we have seen across the Arab region, of dictators just becoming stronger and more brutal. So when the uprising happened in Syria, there was this theorization, if Bashar al-Assad goes down, then the entire Middle East will become unstable, not recognizing that we need that instability because we are living such hard and difficult and challenging and fatal realities. So the concern was the instability, and this would mean the emboldenment of Israel's settler colonial project, especially since we have to keep in context the Zionist efforts revolve around Greater Israel, which includes Syria, which includes Lebanon, which includes Jordan. And then let's not remember that the Golan Heights, the Syrian Golan Heights, taken in 1967, are still colonized by the Israeli settler colonial project. So where did the solidarity come from between Palestinians and Syrians? Why was there reintegration in Yarmouk? As Nidal was saying, it was mostly Syrians. The solidarity and the support that Palestinians received in Syria was mostly at the civil society level. It wasn't this institutional support. That was diplomatic agreements and allies and, the treaties that continue to fail mass public. But at an individual and familial and community level, it was the people, the Syrian people. So when the uprising was happening, I saw a lot of invalidation of the demands. I saw a lot of vilification of the Syrian right to self-determination and Syrian right to choose the people that represent them internally and at a global level. And then I saw the complete opposite of that. I saw Palestinians move beyond Palestinian exceptionalism and recognizing the importance of solidarity, recognizing that no matter the uniform, an oppressor is an oppressor, that if you use a sword or you use a gun, you are killing someone on the basis of supremacy. Whether it's factional supremacy or racial supremacy, it's still supremacy. So I was able to see that. And that nurtured more community building, and that nurtured an expansion. So should Palestinians and Syrians work together? You were just asking this, Yazan, to Nidal. And for instance, yes, we should be working together, but we should be working as we are with other struggles around the globe right now, especially as we see Lebanon enter complete darkness because of chronic failure and no one holding accountability. But more than this, because of how we continue to invalidate each other and each other's struggles under different pretexts. So it's regimes, dictators, corporate abuses. I think it's the coming together with all of that. I don't know if I went over time. I don't want to.
No, you're actually under time. So I feel like you can elaborate further on that last point about building organic relationships and ties between Syrian and Palestinian grass movements or resistance movements. So can you talk a bit more about that? Elaborate. How can we do this as Syrians? What can we do for the Palestinians? And what can Palestinians do for Syrians?
Right. So what can Palestinians do for Syrians? I think, well, the first thing is to start listening to the demands and start listening to the needs. Because in the end, what Syrians need gets decided by Syrians, and what's in our resources and capacities and how much we're willing to give. That's where we have to take the control. But so first and foremost is to really brave ourselves and start listening. I know, earlier Joseph was also speaking about how many, influential figures would be afraid to speak about the Palestinian struggle because of what implications that would hold in the global arena. And I saw very similar patterns with Syria, that a lot of Palestinians were afraid to speak about Syria. And for me, that exposed a lot of our hypocritical values, the values we imposed and how much we are embodying it. So for Palestinians, it's to be a little bit more self-reflective and start taking action, because it's been way too long and the costs are way too high. And it begins with stopping the invalidation of the Syrian struggle and stop the drawing of, well, let's pick the better of two evils. No, let's choose choice C. There's always a choice C. It just means we're going to have to create it. It's more work, but there's always a choice C. And it needs a lot of community building. It needs a lot of trust. The only reason we were able to, I genuinely think, cross this latest period, which is terrible and ugly, and I only think it's going to get worse, is because we afforded each other community, despite of factional affiliation, despite of geographical location, despite of you're in diaspora or in Palestine, kullu, all of it comes together, and we need to afford the same to others. I hope that answers, and I don't want to take too much time because Q&A might be more valuable.
I think your point is quite brilliant because if I may, I think one of the powerful things of the last situation was seeing the unity between the Palestinian people, regardless of their location, which as a Syrian, I took very much heart to that. It gave me quite a lot of hope for, my cause, and because like the Palestinian Syrians are dispersed around the world at the moment. And I think that was quite powerful. Now, what do you think, Mariam, and we can actually start bringing in the others and we can start our discussion, they could pass on for everyone. What do you think about how we can deal with the problematic components within international solidarity? I'll be very blatant, where I'm thinking of examples like Gray Zone that really created a lot of fissures between the Palestinian solidarity movement and the Syrian solidarity movement, I think particularly in the American context. So how, if Mariam can answer that first, and then Joe, you can jump in and take the thread from there.
I think that's a really good question. And I think it's rooted also in what Joe touched on, a class issue, right? Again, for me, what I saw, even for solidarity movements with Palestine, namely from the US and global North, was again, this delegitimization that we can know what we need and we can know our demands and we can know how to get it. That there's this constant trying to say, well, no, you have no idea what's going to happen if we do listen to your demands. And I think it's rooted in arrogance, and a lot of the arrogance in the international sphere. This continued, for example, with Palestine, the continued assumption that the US is going to broker peace here, even though the US still treats it as a conflict and not a settler colonial issue. I think it was the same thing with Syria, that a lot of people just kept saying, well, we know better, we're with you, but we know better. And when you tell them, no, you don't, it kind of creates these fissures and splinters rather than actually, well, maybe we don't. But yeah.
Joe, would you like to pick up that thread?
Yes, I think what we witnessed is in period of uprisings and let's say we can say it, I think quite bluntly, 2011 opened an era of a revolutionary process, this long-term revolutionary process that we have not witnessed the end, quite on the opposite from it, and we witnessed what people call, even though I see it as a continuation, the second wave of the uprisings in Algeria, Sudan, Lebanon, and Iraq. And even though today you can see with all the support, international support, whether directly or indirectly to the Syrian regime, the Syrian revolutionary process is far from being ended. The latest events in Dar'a, what we witnessed, I mean, during even the so-called presidential elections of Bashar Assad, huge sectors of Dar'a as a region, not only about the city, Dar'a governorate, just boycotted the elections, refusing any polls to be, to be handled in the villages, neighborhoods, etc. And you have huge, placards supporting the Syrian revolution, and you have increasing, forms of, I would say, criticism within Syria, even from what people call, even though I'm not particularly fan of this word, loyalist against the Syrian regime, increasing gap and criticism, and this shows also when for sectors, let's say, of the international left, because also we shouldn't homogenize there. A lot of us are from the left and supported the vice uprising, even though we were a minority, unfortunately. But I think it's going back again to this issue of having the belief that there's no short path, but we cannot trust states, basically. Even so-called states that, rhetorically speaking, support the Palestinians or so-called resistance through arm, etc. The real solidarity that we can build and seek the Palestinian support is from below. And this, the international left, unfortunately, forgot the history of this, what we talked in introduction of this solidarity from below, from the region. No one talked, for example, the solidarity of what Nidal spoke about, Palestinian refugee camps, and even though it's more kind, as Nidal explained, neighborhoods, they were not separated, especially in Syria, from a lot of them from the neighborhoods of cities, etc. You had forms of support directly organizing. And again, it's a lack of knowledge, it's a lack of history of the region, and especially Syria was no one knew a lot, I think, on the history of the left in Syria, and also had a lot of misbelief of a so-called resistant regime. And if you see the history, we didn't speak about another case of a Palestinian Syrian thinker that passed away quite recently in the past few years, but Salah Mikhail, who was a Palestinian Syrian thinker, who was imprisoned in '91 by the Syrian regime for condemning the collaboration of the Syrian regime for the U.S. Intervention in Iraq and Kuwait. And other times he was also in the mid-90s and the beginning of the uprising also. So even the voice of the new left or people that represented a left from below were not heard. And again, I think we touched to a point that is key, is that if you don't believe that people can liberate themselves through mass action from below, solidarity from below, and you try to make collaboration with capitalist regime, it's a dead path. And unfortunately, again, I think it's not only the West, we see the same thing in the Middle East, unfortunately.
Indeed. I would like to move on and ask Nidal a question. As a Syrian Palestinian, what do you think, Nidal, of Palestinian perceptions towards the Syrian uprising? And I would like to add, what do you think of Syrian perceptions towards the Palestinian cause?
Well, you are touching actually very sensitive issue, because it's very personal, and it's sometimes I feel that it's very hard for me to be really neutral in this, when I analyze or on a panel, to an extent, I could cry any minute now, it was because it's very hard for me as a Palestinian who his father was born in Palestine, became a refugee in a refugee camp in Syria. It's very hard for me to feel that I have to convince another Palestinian that I am in pain, and there is not any difference between an Israeli F and a Russian MiG. Both of them they kill, and being under the rubble, it does not have a feeling when you are dead, right? So people who died in Yarmouth Camp, I'm not gonna talk about Ghouta, I'm not gonna talk about anywhere else in Syria or Idlib or Daraa or any massacre that happened. I'm just gonna talk about a Palestinian neighborhood was built because the Zionist colonial project and displaced my parents to Syria, and then they lived the same experience on the hands of the very regime that is supporting their cause. It's it is very personal, it's very hard, it's very sensitive, but we have to admit that there is a huge division on the globe. And I'll go back a little bit and tell you this. When the Syrian, especially after al-Ghouta attacks in 2013, this is when the whole global and international community's policies towards Syria started to be clearer. We started to ask ourselves one question: Is the international community norms and the standards were bad before Syria, and then Syria came and just uncovered them? Or just Syria divided the world, and now we are going into another phase and another to create a new thing, not only in the region but also around the world? And I don't have the answer for this yet, to be honest with you. All what I know that the whole world is going behind and running after ideology more than we have to be caring about the human rights issues, about the feeling of being murdered. I'll give you one very example, which for me also personally, it was very hard. Nizar Banat, for example, Nizar Banat was like a supportive of the Syrian government, supportive of the displacement of Syrians in Ghouta. And he has, like, when I went through, I've never known him, never heard of him, but when I went through his tweet, it was very hard for me even to read. But I had the capacity, and thanks God until I have it, like, to have sympathy to him because he was murdered because of his opinion, not because he was shooting others in the streets, right? But it was harder for me to read the comments on his death from Palestinians and from Syrians. You know, like, when we lose this sense of humanity, of sympathizing with each other's, when we are all under the same sword and under the same and being killed, when we lose this sense, I think we know to what extent this situation that we are in is divisive and hard, and that to get out of this situation, I don't know that if there is an answer or a simple plan or a roadmap for this, whether it should be from bottom up or from bottom up. But what I know is that we are going into a struggle, and we yet to understand where we are and how to move forward. And the whole division in the international solidarity movement around Syria and around Palestine, and how Syria divided this solidarity movement, and vice versa, how Palestine later, what happened in Sheikh Jarrah, also uncovered a lot of facts and a lot of things like around the world. I think we need more discussions globally. It's not about the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. It's not about the neighborhood of Yarmouth Camp. It's not about the neighborhood of Al-Ghouta. It's more about what we are living in today, and like our human rights standards, that it's not taken seriously, and people are discussing it. They are disagreeing on facts that murder is wrong, killing is wrong, genocide is wrong, you know? And, you know, like a gray zone and others, I don't want to name a lot, but these are like tools, and the cheap tools, to be honest with you. Also, I agree that they are playing a huge role in dividing and spreading left-wing Trump fake news, you know, like our Trump ideology. Like, this is what I call them. But they are a small tool in all this huge struggle, big struggle that we are going through now. And Syria, Palestine is only two examples of this. We have Cuba, we have Venezuela, we have all what's going on. Like, we have Myanmar. Man, I mean, like, I looked at Myanmar when the revolution there started, and I started seeing this very same scenes I saw in the streets of Damascus. You know, like, when things erupted in Ramallah and people started calling al-Sha'b yurid isqat al-Nizam, we saw this in Saht al-Tahrir in Egypt, in Tunisia, and everywhere. You know, like, peoples are united in the general sense about behind their human rights, before their rights, because this is what they want. But when it comes to the movements themselves, these well-established or established movements who were established in in the last century, and they failed to catch up with history. I think this is where we are now, and this is where like we are in this revision now, and I don't know how long it's gonna take. I don't know where it's gonna go. Like this is like now like for me personally, I am in this I am in this phase now. I'm saying what's after democracy. You know?
Thank you so much, Nidal. Let's talk tactics, and I'm going to use one of the questions that came in the comments. It says here, the left in the US has planned demonstrations for Palestine and some for Syria. Should we, people in the US, call for joint demonstrations from here on out? Is that a tactic? Should there be joint demonstrations unifying the Palestinian cause and the Syrian cause? Please, anyone jump in. Mariam?
Can I touch on, yeah, I want to touch on this. So the question isn't, should we call for joint demonstrations from here on out? In Palestine, we use the chants that we hear from Syria, and we use them very proudly and very loudly. And I think what we should be asking is, why do we need to ask? If two people should stand, you know, and amplify one another's voices, amplify the struggles, is why are we even asking this question, I think. Could be a better use of our intellectual labor. But other than that, it's due. A lot of us may sit and question what forms of solidarity. Does it come from below? Does it come from above? Is it at an institutional level? Is it at a community level? I always believe it will gravitate towards community, because that's how leaders are created and representatives. You start with community. But more than this is to just do. And that's something we learned in the most recent phase. A lot of people were asking, what can we do? What should we do? Should we do it together or not? But just do right by community. And as Nidal was just explaining, things are often simpler than they are more complicated. What's complicated is the diplomatic language that imposes certain connotations, but it's often simple.
Thanks, Mariam. Joe, do you want to jump in about tactics and strategies allying both movements?
No, I think definitely it's more than the issue about doing joint demonstrations. I think it depends on the context. It depends on the context, what time we're talking about. I'm obviously not opposed about it, but it's about seeing the links between the different causes, and to learn about the different experiences of solidarity, of resistance from below. And in both cases, I think there's a lot to learn. And in the Palestinian case of resistance since the beginning of the 20th century, until to today, the various intifadas that don't stop to 2 intifadas, as very often explained, but we stopped counting on this issue. And in Syria, to learn also of past mistakes, because what is interesting to see is that states learn from each other. Elites learn from each other. Nidal was talking about Myanmar. What is interesting is after the beginning of the protest, who has invested in telecoms Myanmar? The current Prime Minister of Lebanon, or who has been designated as so, Miati. And where we see the problem of not learning to each other and not seeing that our combined resistance is a threat to the elite is seen by certain sections of the elite. Avigdor Lieberman, minister at the time in 2011, said the biggest threat to Israel in 2011 is not Iran. He said it's the Egyptian uprising. And he said because it could start a movement far more important in the whole region. And historically, they have understood that collaboration with the various groups of progressive groups linking democratic and social issues is the biggest threat to Israel. Why did Israel intervene in the 70s and after 80s in Lebanon, especially, to destroy the collaboration between the PLO and the left? And you can see in 67, the war against Egypt and Syria. So what I think is the most important, because tactics, I think we need to be very flexible. Joint demonstration, maybe not. Depends on the context. But moreover, learning from each other, our history of resistance, how to, seeing what we discussed for the past hour, how it is linked. Today we see how much the integration of Israel in the region of Middle East and North Africa with states, the continuous normalization, the continuous exchange, not only on economic policies, but also on security issues. The whole issue about, Israel selling to the whole Middle East security, which is not new, but has been increased in the past 2 decades, to check on their own protesters, Morocco, etc., Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc. You can see that whereas they learn very fast to collaborate with each other, we should learn as well. And in this sense, we could add other than Palestine, Syria. We could add also add, the Kurdish struggle. We could learn about, what happening and what has happened for the past 3 decades with the Zapatistas, Black Lives Matters. What would be interesting for me is to see how, for example, what we witnessed with Black Lives Matters in Palestine. We should see similar things regarding Syria, Kurdistan. And this is what I think is the strategic issue. I think flexible on the tactical issues, but on the strategies issue, be very clear what we need and what we want.
Thank you so much, Joe. Nidal, do you want to touch on this topic?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that we have to work on. I think there is not, or change is not a decision in the sense. I think it's a process, and people around the world. I think we are in a phase that they are going through a process to figure out how to change things around, how to change politics, how to change dictatorships, how to change regimes, how to change their lives. We know what imperialism is. We know what capitalism is. This is very clear. We know their visions. We know where they are going. We know their point of view. But I think the question today is about left, about socialism, about where they are today and where they should be tomorrow. Should they continue, or should this theory just go put to sleep and start something else? I think we should open this discussion very loudly and more often. I think because this discussion and this very issue about left and socialism and what happened in Syria and what's going on in Palestine and Cuba and Venezuela, because this is what showed us how divided this part of the world is, and we don't know how to move forward yet. At such discussions, now we are touching Syria and Palestine. Continue these discussions, these panels, writing, reading, raising awareness about people, because people are exposed to the narrative, to narrative in a way or another that they don't know except anything but this narrative. I'll give you one example and I would close with this. In Palestine, people are exposed, even if we are on social media, Facebook, Twitter, blah, 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 all these things, but there is a governmental narrative at the end of the day, and they control it with the support of their alliances. What people in Palestine were exposed to is a narrative that was going on in Syria, is like the rise of ISIS and the rise of Jabhat al-Nusra, and this was a narrative very well written by the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas and his team and his intelligence, Majid Faraj, who is he goes back and forth to Damascus every 2 weeks and coordinates everything. And I will give you also one unknown example about how they coordinate with each other, and then how they build the narrative that they expose their people to. Mahmoud Abbas, funny enough, this small West Bank that is under occupation and colonial project, and it was working with Russians to strike the deal of the chemical weapons attack after Ghouta in 2013. Abu Mazen was personally involved, and all his institutions, including the intelligence, to strike a deal between Bashar al-Assad and Obama. And they succeeded in that. And then they built way more coordination and cooperative channels between Syria and Palestine, and they made sure that people in West Bank and Gaza, especially in West Bank, to know that what's going on in Palestine and Syria is a conspiracy, and just what aims to destroy the last front line for resistance in the region. And so this kind of narratives needs counter narrative, and I think for us as people who still believe in democracy, human rights, we are in decline now. And this is why you see other media outlets like a gray zone, is blossoming and spreading a lot of information and working around the clock just to make sure that people are convinced in their narrative. And I'm really worried that they are succeeding now, and without any counter narrative.
Thanks, Nidal. Joe, would you like to add? Yes, please.
Yeah, sorry, Yazan. Thank you, Nidal. And fortunately, Mariam, I think, left. I can see her, but what I just wanted, okay, just wanted maybe something we didn't mention today, but I think is important also, especially as we're talking about Palestine, is to continue to support, first of all, the campaign of BDS, Boycott, Disinvestment, Sanction, that is working, and we've seen, signs of solidarity from below, a true sign of internationalism, workers in different ports refusing, for example, to transport, weapons towards Israel, etc. We've seen different, workers, trade unions demanding, pension funds to be divest from particular Israeli funds, etc., or funding. And I think this is important to learn from, again, in the Syrian case, while acknowledging that Syria's regime is very different from Israel. The nature of them doesn't mean that it's less worse or far worse. It's different. It's not a settled colonial state. Acknowledging that Syria's integration in the world economy is not similar to Israel. But learning BDS has been fantastic to educate and act. And this is, I think, what we need in the Syrian case, and building solidarity from below. Unfortunately, and again, I'm putting this forward because it's important, since the beginning of the uprising, what we called, if it's not the best term, civil society actors, Syrian civil society actors, have been seeking support from above, calling for sanctions, and sanctions that are wide, not only against particular personalities, against human rights violation, that I support completely. And I think what happened last year in Germany and other countries, attacking Syrian generals or Syrian people that committed war against humanity is very good. But I think what is needed today is how to entrench the Syrian revolutionary process and support to it in communities where Syrians are based. And this means doing links with other causes. And I think BDS has been able to do this in a lot of cases, links with trade unions, linked with various forms of association, local struggles. And I think this is something we have to think about Syrians. In communities where we are today, we have more than 6 million officially refugees outside of Syria, in neighboring countries. And from there, I think discussion needs to come. But I think we have a lot to learn from BDS in this aspect, and which has brought not only Arab or Palestinian communities, but and we've seen huge form of internationalism. So I think this is something also to reflect on what we discussed today, people's resistance.
Thank you so much, Joe. I think with that, we can leave it on a high note, because that definitely leaves food for thought. I would like to thank our speakers, Mariam, who had to leave, unfortunately, Joe and Nidal in their respective places for their intervention today. I think one thing that we can take from here is the importance of forming an internationalist politics in the coming era. Nidal, you said that the coming era is frightful, and I agree with this prognosis. I think this century is a wicked century. It's wicked in terms of how horrible it will be, from climate change to economics to the increase of fascism and brutality of states. So it's very important, I believe, that people align, that we form a sort of politics that doesn't center ideology, but actually focuses and centers on people from below, and try and support and develop them. And I think the cases of Syria and Palestine and their interactions, the challenges they've faced with each other, and the successes that they have developed with each other are lessons for us all. But I am actually I'm a past optimist, and I believe that in the long run, people will be victorious. Before I end, I just want to say that this panel, and we should thank obviously our sponsors who support this panel, especially the Revive the Peace Movement, the Global Campaign for Solidarity with the Syrian Revolution, New Politics magazine, and People Demand Change for supporting this. As noted previously, if you want to be part of RPM's listserv, in the comments of YouTube, you will find a link to a document to add your name and email. And I just want to say that as a past optimist, I do believe that in the future, I will be willing and I will be able to have breakfast in Damascus, lunch in Beirut, and dinner in Gaza, all in the same day. And I say Gaza and not Jerusalem. Why? Because as we all know, the Ghazawis are better cooks. And with that, I really wish my solidarity and hope and best wishes for you, the speakers, our sponsors, the audience, and everyone else in this world. Thank you very much for joining us. Really, really appreciate your time this Saturday. And we look forward to having more events like this to talk about our movements and how to tie them together in our battles against regimes. Thank you guys very much for joining us, and thank you, Mariam, who isn't here. And with that, I think we are done. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.